Hey, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. We sure are glad to have Rabbi Kaufman in the studio tonight to talk Iran deal, talk about the broader picture in the Middle East too. If we get to it, the Iran deal by itself, I think, is probably broad enough for the hour that we've got. But and I know that I'm going to pose this because you're talking about the three agendas and you laid them out really well. I know that Doc is going to just. He's licking his chops figuratively to sink his teeth into me on this one, but. We've seen this before. We've seen economic outreach and opening up relationships with countries that have been problematic for us in the past, and we've seen those relationships normalized to the extent that we have China, second biggest economy in the world, certainly not a human rights leader, certainly not a free open society the way that we would want to see it, but certainly those relationships have been normalized to the extent that that we have trade with them, we have investment with them, and we've benefited from those relationships over the past. We have the opening of relations with the Soviet Union over decades softened that regime, a regime that no one thought could be dealt with, and we've seen we saw some movement in the Green Revolution in Iran a few years ago that the population is not super enamored 100% of the time with the folks that are running the show over there. Isn't this posture from the United States, or at least it can kind of appear to be that way, an olive branch that that maybe is the first step towards bringing them back out from the cold?
Well, the way I look at it is this: it could work. It could work. It could work. Let's say, in the best of all worlds, you have a large influx of money and large influx of business that employs a whole bunch of people. And you have a developing middle class in Iran that becomes dependent on Western jobs, and the government decides that income coming from Western jobs is going to be impossible to do without, and therefore they're worried that they could face boycotts and sanctions over their behavior in the region, and everything calms down. Right? That's possible. That's possible, and right?
So that's possible. And I think. Oh, go ahead.
But the problem with that is that there's also the possibility that the regime uses the money to support the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They spread the money around the region to their proxies, increasing the danger for Israel, for Saudi Arabia, for United Arab Emirates, for Bahrain, for Jordan, and a number of other places, including the Lebanese, who would then face an oppressive Hezbollah regime controlling Lebanon. And that instead of weakening the regime through economic growth in Iran, we could actually strengthen the regime, because the regime could be seen as the employer of all the people in Iran. Everybody could become dependent on the regime, and they could be less willing to challenge the regime than they are now. The violence could increase in the region with more weapon supplies going all over the place. So what you end up with is something that on the one hand could be good, and on the other hand could be really bad. And so what you've got is a highly dangerous situation,
a dangerous,
especially from the position of Israel and our allies.
And Doc, what I hear in that comparison is the calculus that we're trying to make is: do we believe that the Iranian regime is inherently irrational? Because while I hear everything that Rabbi you're saying about about the problems and the disaster that could happen, so they take the money that they get and they spend it on stuff. Well, I mean, don't Western investment look at that and say, oh, well, we can't do business with folks that are going to take our money and use it to kill people and pull out and they're right back where they started. An irrational regime or a militant regime would absolutely do something like that. They wouldn't care, right? But do we think, Doc, that there's some rationality in the Iranian regime? And I think that's the Republican response to that.
Well, I can't speak for all Republicans, okay? Right. But the bottom line is the rabbi hit it right on the head. Yeah, there's a potential for this, but the greater potential is that things are going to go bad. You mentioned Russia.
I don't think you said greater potential, but...
No, I'd said that it was going to be a greater potential that it's going to go bad rather than good. Those are my words, not Rabbi Kaufman's.
Right.
You mentioned Russia. Well, geez, we were able to peacefully coexist with them. This is the problem with the younger generation. They forget about the Cold War. It was a war. We fought wars all over the world, and we beat them. That's the only reason we were able to get along with them for a decade, is because they were destitute. And then suddenly they started getting a lot of money because oil prices went up from Europe. Russians essentially have a stranglehold on Europe, and they're not past being belligerent.
Oil and natural gas. Don't forget natural gas.
Yes, natural gas as well. You look at China, right? One, a Republican president went there, opened up the trade gates. Two, a Democratic president gave them most favored nation. And three, they're still belligerent. They run their planes in front of ours. Now, here's a little known secret, but our F-14 Tomcats, if you disrupt the airflow in front of the engines, they stall. So when you see these encounters with the Chinese and they're flying their planes that close, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get that pilot's plane to stall. They're still belligerent. They're building airstrips in disputed territory with Japan. They're continuing to be belligerent. When you start talking about a belligerent nation, right? People think Putin's crazy. He's not. That guy is brilliant. When they start talking about the leadership of Iran about being crazy, they're not crazy. They're brilliant. They're brilliant like a fox. And if you think that doing these sanctions or undoing these sanctions is suddenly going to make them friendly to us, that isn't true. Look at how much money we spend in the Middle East now that support these regimes that are hostile to us in the hopes that something good will happen. Now, maybe the business climate will change, but just like in Russia, they essentially kicked out all the Western businesses, seized their assets, and now they're not even letting food in for a while.
Part of what was going on with this is even before the negotiations began, our European allies and Russia and China were all insisting that the sanctions be ended anyway. And we're probably going to end the sanctions regardless of what happened here. So one of the issues was very clearly, I think, that the administration wanted to get something before those sanctions just ended anyway, at least the non-American sanctions. And the majority of the sanctions that are on Iran are American sanctions. It's still the vast majority of the impact of this agreement has to do with American sanctions. You forget that there's a big three-letter word here, which is oil, that's involved. And the fact that Iran's oil is going to come onto the market is going to have an impact. At least a much larger amount of oil is going to come onto the market than has been on the market.
Maybe depress prices even worse.
Let's talk about the oil impact after this break. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back with Rabbi Kaufman. We are excited to have him here and our little button. Let's give a little round of applause for the Rabbi. Be back right after this break.